I'm your host. Well, you may know me as Mr. Black, and this is the Something So Strange podcast. Something So Strange is a podcast where I cover 40 in news, do deep dives into lesser-known paranormal cases, as well as share stories sent to me by my listeners. In this, the first episode of the series, I look at the Catskill incident. A chilly, rainy November night, two friends settle into their hastily constructed tent just inside the Catskill Forest Preserve. Within hours, these two friends would flee their campsite in terror. What happened? What did they encounter? In this episode, I will delve into the Catskill incident. Vincent L. and John D., two Brooklyn natives, had planned on an off-season weekend camping trip. Their destination? The heavily wooded Catskill Forest Preserve, which was about 100 miles northwest of New York City. On Friday, November 7, 1975, the two young men set off. It was not exactly an ideal situation, as rain poured heavily and there was a chill in the air. When they arrived, they discovered that all the overnight spots were deserted. No campers and no park rangers. As the two friends departed their vehicle and made their way along the forest trail, they soon happened upon a rough, wooden picnic shelter, a structure consisting of 4 columnar supports and a high roof. They determined that this would be the best place to stay dry, and so they quickly built their tent and settled in for the evening. Both were quite exhausted from the late afternoon drive and the brief hike in, so falling asleep was not difficult. Awakened by strange sounds. At around 1 a.m., Vincent and John found themselves awakened by sounds coming from a garbage can, which was propped up near the shelter. John was desperate to get back to sleep and decided that he would go out and attempt to scare off the animal he presumed was rooting around in the garbage can causing the ruckus. Upon looking back, both men noted how they were unusually and simultaneously wide awake during this moment. As John unzipped the tent and pointed his flashlight on the ground outside, something strange happened. The first of many strange things on that cold November night. The instant the beam from his flashlight hit the ground, the tent interior became darker, and both men realized that something akin to moonlight had been shining through the semi-translucent tent walls. With this, both men stepped outside the tent and peered around the darkened forest. They saw nothing. This in itself was unusual, since there was no animal near the can and no animal tracks anywhere on the muddy ground. John had assumed that it was a raccoon that had come around looking for an evening snack, though he could find no paw prints anywhere near the receptacle. John's next thought was that it might have been a bear, though again they could find nothing to indicate as such. Unsure of what was going on, John and Vincent elected to move the trash can further away from their camping area. As they were in the process of sliding the can over, they suddenly heard a strange, quote, sonar-like sound passing back and forth above them, which they presumed in the darkness to be some kind of bird. They looked around the area and spotted something pretty far back in the forest, something they had not noticed earlier. To them it looked like a, quote, streamlined camper trailer. The two men decided that, at some point in the evening, some people had arrived and set up camp, and most likely they had been the source of the lights and sounds. John wanted to take a closer look and ventured into the woods. Vincent tagged along, following closely behind him. John had gone barely a few yards when he realized this was no ordinary camper trailer. It had a smooth, irregular shape, a mast on one end with some kind of spinning unit mounted to it. But most surprising of all, its entire surface appeared to be faintly luminous. Vincent, close on his heels, had the same startled reaction at the same time. As they stood staring at this strange vehicle, both men felt an overwhelming sense that something was not right, and they quickly retreated back to their shelter. They huddled together on the ground outside their tent, trying to convince one another that it could not have been what they thought it was. John was adamant that such things did not exist. "There's no such thing. There's no such thing," he repeated over and over. The figure in the woods. As the two men sat talking, John, still holding the flashlight, swung it idly to his left, illuminating a figure standing in the woods. This figure, which appeared to be looking at them, was tall and simple in outline, with two large dark eyes and a series of diagonal slashes or stripes on one cheek being the only interruptions in the clear, undetailed shape. Its surface was also faintly luminous. Thoroughly spooked, John swung the flashlight beam around and picked up three more of the creatures, one of which was apparently in a tree. These figures were absolutely silent and identical, except that the number of cheek stripes varied. Later drawings suggested that the beings appeared almost like white-sheeted ghosts. In fact, John and Vincent actually briefly believed these apparitions were created by slide projectors or something like it. It was only when the creatures approached it within 15 feet that they realized they were more dimensional in nature and not mere projections. Night Siege. From this point on, John and Vincent's night would take a horrific turn as a state of siege ensued. Over and over, the spectral figures approached and withdrew, approached and withdrew. The men noted that the figures moved with incredible ease, especially when factoring in the dense undergrowth in the woods. Despite their close proximity at times, no arms or legs could be discerned within their closed silhouettes. Most mysterious of all, each time the flashlight beam fell upon one of the figures, it would stop, remaining immobile until the beam was removed. As the two men studied these figures, it soon became clear to them that the one figure with three stripes, which hovered towards the back of the group, seemed to control the others, for when the light beam fell upon it, all the others were simultaneously immobilized. John and Vincent were convinced that the objective of these entities was to take them. Where to, they had no idea. Vincent even believed that he and John might not make it out of the forest alive. Later, when Vincent recounted the nightmarish experience to researchers, he noted, "I really thought I was going to die there." Realizing that in light and fire they had their only defensive weapon, the two men, using axes, proceeded to build up their campfire. They stuck close to the fire, always on guard for the approach of these creatures. They contemplated a getaway. Their car was parked 100 feet away in a cement parking lot that serviced the picnic area. But both men were too afraid to leave the campfire to make a break for it. The campfire, powered by Duraframe logs, had swelled to dramatic proportions. After a short but tense while, the mysterious figures withdrew back into the darkness of the forest. John and Vincent had noticed earlier that one of the figures, way over to their left, had been slowly approaching them, accompanied by an apparently hovering flat object that John described as looking like a small, wheelless covered wagon. It was perhaps 30 inches wide by 6 feet long. It had several hoops running up across its width, and these hoops supported what looked like a transparent plexiglass-type cover. All of these descriptions both men insisted were as accurate as they could remember, though they underlined the fact that they were totally petrified during the encounter. A kind of Alamo. As the siege continued, John and Vincent grabbed at anything within range of the fire that they could use. This included picnic tables and benches, which they transformed into a sort of makeshift barricade, a kind of Alamo, one of them noted, in front of their tent. At some point, all of the creatures withdrew back into the woods, and Vincent decided this would be the perfect time to try to get away. He tossed their possessions into the tent, cut the ropes, and raced down to the car to start the engine. John remained under the picnic shelter at the fireside. He remembered that he had a camera and was desperate to try and photograph these creatures. Soon they re-emerged out of the forest and began heading towards him. Before he had raised the camera to his eye, Vincent shouted for him to put it down. Vincent noted the flash it would give off. "They'll think it's a weapon," he yelled to his friend. John immediately put the camera down. He realized that this was now the time to flee, and so he dumped some of his water on the fire and quickly broke for the car. As the fire began to sputter out, the figures rushed towards the campsite. The escape. Josh claims that he went down the stairs 6 at a time to the parking lot below, but there was a problem with the car's engine. Vincent recalls that at first the motor almost died, then surged forward, quote, "the wheels leaving rubber." But John remembers, quote, "the battery going dead and the car not starting immediately." Though their memories were clouded by panic and desperation, one thing remains clear: the car did not perform as it should have. Moments later, John and Vincent tore out of the park, heading for home in a state approaching abject terror. John remembers a stretch of road marked by small, metal-enclosed glass reflectors down the center strip. The moment their headlights picked up the row of glowing spots, John and Vincent were in near hysterics, assuming that their luminous tormentors were still with them. At 3:30 a.m., they passed through the toll barrier at the New York State Thruway, an hour to an hour and a quarter drive from the scene of their encounter. Since the encounter commenced at 1 a.m., when they woke, they estimated that the entire experience involving the entities lasted, at minimum, a little over an hour, though it felt much longer. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by our patrons on Patreon. If you would like to support this project and get access to the video versions, head on over to patreon.com/beyondcreepy. Now, back to the story. Aftermath. Assuming that nobody would believe their bizarre story, the two men refrained from reporting the encounter to the authorities, though they did gradually confide in their parents, their girlfriends, and their girlfriends' parents. Both John and Vincent were deeply shaken by what had happened, and in the week following skipped school classes and remained inside their homes. Stella, Vincent's fiancée, whom he would later marry, noted to investigator Bud Hopkins, who wrote of the encounter in the July 1979 issue of MUFON Journal, that he was, quote, "white as a sheet for days." Also, she noticed a day or so after the incident that on his back there were several diagonal abrasions above one another, which straddled his lower spine. The faint scar marks were still visible at the time of Hopkins' publishing of his article. John also had troubles in the days after the incident. This included the sudden appearance of a small burning mark near his navel. It slowly expanded downwards towards the groin and was consistently painful. As the weeks passed, 2 other similar marks developed in the same region. He eventually consulted his doctor, though he did not mention the events at the campsite. By April, 6 months after his encounter, the mark had gotten so bad that John's doctor sent him for tests. A kidney tumor was suspected. A kidney specialist and a dermatologist were brought into the case. An exploratory operation was suggested and eventually canceled. Nothing was ever found to be the cause of the disturbing marks. John was released after 7 days and pronounced perfectly healthy. In his report, Hopkins summed up his feelings about the two men, noting that he found them to be honest and direct men of normal intelligence and down-to-earth practicality. I have interviewed Vincent and his wife Stella, and John and his girlfriend Maria, all in person. I have interviewed Vincent's brother-in-law by telephone. There is no doubt in my mind that these two young men are reporting, to the best of their ability, what they experienced. I was able initially to interview Vincent and John separately by telephone, so each told me his story twice. No important discrepancies appeared in the accounts. In fact, the separate versions dovetailed perfectly. Their truthfulness is beyond question. Also, I believe that they probably were abducted, the abduction taking place either before they awoke in their tent at the very beginning of the siege or afterwards, from their car, which had difficulties achieving power for the escape. The marks on their body, of course, are a strong indication of a probable abduction. Hopkins further noted that both men independently entertained the idea that they were taken, in part because of the physical marks on their bodies, but also due to the strange dreams and apparent flashbacks they began experiencing. Vincent told Hopkins that he would have a recurring image of himself lying on some sort of table and looking over his right shoulder through a round window to what appeared to be earth below. John, while in his hospital bed, experienced unusual fear when a nurse bent down over him for a routine check. On another occasion, Hopkins noted John had a flashback of being, quote, picked up, a rare experience, he points out, for a tall man who weighs 245 pounds. In hopes of dispelling the notion that the two men were influenced by UFO literature, Hopkins noted that neither man was very much interested in the topic. After their encounter, John admitted that he went out and bought and later read Blum's Beyond Earth and Hynek's The UFO Experience in hopes of finding answers to his strange experience. Vincent, for his part, was simply too frightened to want to hear or read anything on the subject. While some skeptics might insist that the two men were out to make a buck, Hopkins made it clear that neither John or Vincent ever sought publicity. In fact, they demanded total and complete anonymity. Vincent went on to become an automobile salesman, while John was employed by a large insurance company in Manhattan. Neither man has ever made a single penny from the telling of their experience. The follow-up. Around the time of the publication of his article, Bud Hopkins and UFO researcher Ted Blocker had discussed the prospect of utilizing hypnosis to possibly uncover the events of that evening. While John and Vincent were very receptive to the idea, both confessed a great fear of what they might recall. During their follow-up investigation, Blocker and Hopkins went to the Catskill Forest Preserve to photograph the location of the incident and look for any ground traces, since prior to their seeing the glowing object on the ground before they emerged from the tent, they had heard the sounds of tree branches snapping. They hoped to find evidence of broken tree branches and such. They also intended on interviewing John's doctors, though it is unclear if that ever happened. Hopkins also noted a series of weird coincidences. One very interesting final point should be made. This Catskill incident occurred in a time of high UFO activity. 5 abduction cases have been reported within the 13-day period from October 27th to November 8, 1975, including both the Travis Walton and Poland Springs, Maine cases. Final summary. I was a little surprised upon seeing John and Vincent's drawings of the entity, if only because how closely they resembled ghosts, or at least the white-sheeted depictions of ghosts that we've become accustomed to through movies and horror literature. The Catskill entities are also some of the more aggressive entities that I'm aware of, in that they over and over advance towards the witnesses, as opposed to retreating from them, which is common in the vast majority of these entity cases. Another interesting aspect of the case is the being's apparent fear of light. I've never quite heard of another case in which beings were stopped in their tracks by a flashlight beam shining on them. This might speak to the sort of projected quality of their appearance, as both men thought at first that they were observing a projected image as opposed to a three-dimensional being. Curiously, many of the Glimmerman or predator-like entities sighted around the world are described as appearing projected too. Is there a connection? I do agree with Hopkins' assessment that they were probably taken from their campsite, and if you trust Vincent's dreams, probably very, very far away from their campsite, possibly the planet itself. Though the shortened window of time between waking and departing the camp, a little over an hour, leads me to believe that if indeed it happened, then it must have played out prior to them waking at 1 a.m. Though I am at a loss to explain why the beings would attempt to snatch them if they had already examined them, unless something went wrong, unless they still had work left to do. I know there are skeptics who will dismiss this case as nothing more than a shared panicked hallucination, or swamp gas, or pranksters, or some other such nonsense. The fact remains, Vincent and John were both hard-working men with good jobs. They were not prone to making up stories, especially stories that could lead to ridicule from their peers. They never sought publicity for, nor did they ever profit from, their experience. They simply had a story to tell, and they told it. And they provided proof via strange marks left on their bodies. And despite their numerous tellings and retellings, their story never changed. The Catskills. The Catskill Mountains, also known as the Catskills, are a physiographic province of the larger Appalachian Mountains, located in southeastern New York. As a cultural and geographic region, the Catskills are generally defined as those areas close to or within the borders of the Catskill Park, a 700,000-acre forest preserve forever protected from many forms of development under New York state law. Numerous types of animals, including white-tailed deer, black bears, and fishers, are known to reside there. As detailed in Lisa LaMonica's book Haunted Catskills, the Catskill Mountain Range is also home to all sorts of bizarre phenomena, including spook lights, time slips, ghosts, shadow beings, and even some weird cryptids. Author David Paulides has documented some truly bizarre missing persons cases from the Catskills in his Missing 411 series, while Albert Rosales, author of the Humanoid Journals, a series of books that document over 20,000 entity cases, claims that there have been more than a dozen alien abduction incidents in the Catskills. As well, there are even reports involving gnomes, giant evil birds, and little people. A quick scan of the various UFO databases will reveal nearly 100 sightings of anomalous objects in the area in the past 50 years. This episode of the podcast was brought to you by our patrons on Patreon. If you would like to support this project and get access to the video versions, head on over to patreon.com/beyondcreepy. Background music provided by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license.